It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Jessie today, because I kind of almost feel a little bit like one of Jessie's sort of academic mothers. I met Jessie when she was a fresh PhD student. She actually came out to visit in Australia, and I've watched with great pleasure as she has had this sort of meteoric rise in academia. And it seems like in almost the 5 minutes since I saw her in Australia, she's now, of course, a reader in psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. So she's had, had an amazing research career, and I could say a lot about it, but I want to pass over to Jessie. But I guess the thing that really stands out for me about Jessie's research is that it's extremely rigorous and theoretically strong, but nevertheless always has a very clear focus on translation and on genuinely improving reading outcomes for children. And today's talk on reading in adolescence, an extremely under-researched area, will no doubt be another example of this. So over to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Anne. Yeah, it does feel like 5 minutes ago that I first came to visit you in Melbourne, and also a few years ago as well, all at the same time. Let me just share my screen. Well, I'm very sorry that I can't actually be in Australia giving this talk today, but nonetheless, it's very nice to, in inverted commas, see you all today. And I'm going to talk about a particular focus of my research over the last decade or so, which is thinking about adolescence. And the reason why I came to thinking about this period in development was because I was working on a project looking at primary language impairments and autism spectrum disorder, and working a lot with schools, and with a very large number of schools, about 300 schools. And I just kept going into schools, and they had lots of, we were working in primary and secondary schools. And I think in primary schools, I was used to talking to teachers and speech and language therapists and other staff working in schools about language and literacy. And they felt like they had at least some strategies and materials at their disposal for dealing with that. But when I went into secondary schools, what they were saying to me is actually, here are the children with developmental language disorder that you're interested in, but we have all these other kids that actually don't have the language and literacy skills that they need in order to be able to access the curriculum. So, and we really don't have the materials or the resources or the training to know what to do and what should we do. And it made me realize on looking at the research that we didn't have enough research at all, looking at even what's going on beyond kind of childhood. And I guess I mean from about 10 or 11 onwards, let alone robust research telling us what we should be doing. So that's why I started working in this area. And I'm going to talk to you about two particular projects that I've done in this space today. So the title of the talk today is Beyond Primary School Reading Development and Adolescence. There's been a little bit of chat on Twitter over the last few days in the run up to this talk. And I've been really encouraged to see people saying, yeah, there isn't enough research on this. We want to know more about this. So that's been fantastic. And yes, I agree, there isn't enough. It's starting to come through, and we're starting to understand things a little bit better. But when I started doing this research, I was still very much at the stage of trying to check out what's going on, not even what we should be doing, as I've said. So a lot of today's talk is just thinking about what's going on in adolescence. And then towards the end, we're going to get a little bit more to what we could be doing or how this might be useful in practice. And we can certainly talk more about that in the discussion. So firstly, it sounds like you guys don't need to be persuaded, but one of the things I've had to do quite a lot in the last decade is persuade people that it's of interest to look at reading in adolescence, and that it's important, and that there is an issue. Particularly when I've talked to, sometimes talk to policymakers or some teachers and some members of the public, what they have a tendency sometimes to think is, well, reading, that's a primary issue. It should be fixed by the time they get to the end of primary school. And if it's not been fixed, then there's something wrong with the primary system. And that's something I've very much had to grapple with and say, well, actually, that's not the case. There's loads of excellent stuff happening in primary school. And sometimes you still have children who come through the system and they're still really struggling. Literacy difficulties can be very pervasive and very, very resistant to change, very difficult to sort out. And so I've had to do quite a lot of justification that there is an issue. One really good bit of evidence to support this is evidence from a relatively recent PISA exercise, the international reading assessments that they administer. And when you look internationally, this is true for the UK, but also true for lots of other countries. When you look internationally, about 17 to 20% of adolescents are showing reading that's really quite poor. They don't have kind of basic reading skills that they need to function in everyday society. And I've just put up some of the examples from the 2009 version of that assessment here to show you the kinds of tasks that these adolescents were asked to do, and that this kind of 17 to 20% were really struggling to access these, what seemed to us, I think, quite simple texts. So an extract from 100 Years of Solitude. And then on the right, I think particularly stark is this example, which is just an advert that you might see here. You might see it on the underground train or on a train or on a bus. And just, I think this is a really nice illustration that a lot of our kids are leaving school, essentially, at 15, leaving school without the basic language and literacy skills that they need to function. And I think that means that we should be thinking about it. And the answer is not just to say, well, primary teachers need to fix it. We clearly need to be supporting all the way through the system and thinking about it all the way through the school system. I do think it's a particularly interesting, theoretically, it's particularly interesting time in development to be looking at, as well as practically. And that's because of this shift in expectations. So this happens at school, but it also happens in the way that we think about reading and the purpose of reading. There's a shift in expectation from learning to read and getting the knowledge and the skills that you need to be a successful reader, to using your reading skills to function. And that might be at school, to function in the classroom, or to do your homework, to engage with the curriculum, or it might just be in everyday life, filling out forms and things like that. We need to get to a point where we can functionally use our literacy skills. So there is this shift at that point in time. So it's really important that we make sure that our young people make that shift and that they can use their literacy skills. Otherwise, they're really excluded from a lot that's going on in every sphere, really. Not least exam performance. You need to be able to read the exam papers and read all the materials underpinning the exam. And then, of course, writing becomes really important too. Now, I'm going to focus on reading as an aspect of literacy primarily today, but that's not to say that writing isn't also very, very important. And that's going to be a focus of some research that we're just thinking about at the moment. But today, the focus is going to be on reading. Now, there isn't very much research on this. And when I looked at longitudinal studies kind of tracking reading development through adolescence, what you see in the literature is that there are a certain number of studies that look in close detail at what's happening in primary school or in the younger years. And then there is maybe one time point in adolescence. And so there was a certain amount of research doing that, but not a lot of research actually tracking what's happening and what's changing in adolescence. And that's what I hope to do in the first study I'm going to talk about today. But the studies that are out there did seem to suggest that there is growth, there is progress in reading. We know there's lots of progress in reading early on, you know, as children start learning to read and at the very early stages of learning to read, and that this does kind of slow down. And probably starts plateauing at about the age of 15. So that was the picture that we had in terms of progress and growth at the outset of my research. But it's worth noting that, you know, there are things that are interesting that are happening in adolescence that make us think, well, there must be important stuff happening with reading at this point in time. And I say this because I have encountered quite a lot of people from various different spheres kind of saying, well, you know, is there really anything interesting happening in adolescence? It's all kind of done by then. And I would say quite strenuously that there is. Partly because we know that there continue to be really interesting and important changes in the brain, in the kind of regions of the brain that serve reading, that support reading processes in adolescence. And that also we see some interesting changes in language processing at that time. And of course, spoken language is very much a foundation for reading. So if there's interesting changes happening in spoken language, that suggests that they will also be reflected in reading as well, in written language. So, I mean, you may not have needed persuading, but in case you needed persuading, there are loads and loads of reasons why we might focus on reading in adolescence. Just to give you a bit of a framework, I know most people will be familiar with these kinds of frameworks for thinking about reading, but we often use the simple view of reading that you can see here as a kind of anchor for thinking about reading, thinking about what variation in reading might look like in particular. And what the simple view of reading suggests is that there are two things that need to be in place for successful reading. So you need to be able to read words, of course. You need to get that kind of initial building block sorted so that you can access print. So you need to be able to read words, but you also need to have the language comprehension skills that are going to allow you to understand what you're reading. So the simple view of reading is very simple in just suggesting that these two things are necessary. You need to have both. One on its own isn't going to be enough. It is a very simple view, and you know, of course, there are other things that are also really important for successful reading that aren't captured within the simple view. I mean, I think the important thing about the simple view is that it captures what's necessary to be able to read with some success, whereas other frameworks also include things that we know are really important, like the reading systems framework here includes general knowledge as well, emphasizes general knowledge, and also gives us a little bit more detail about how language comprehension and word reading might be interacting with each other, just a little bit more specification about what's happening in terms of processing. Now today, I'm not only going to focus on reading, I'm also going to focus on spoken vocabulary knowledge. That's very much been a focus of my research. And it's partly because spoken vocabulary knowledge is very, very important for reading. It is a kind of a building block, just as learning to be able to read some words is a building block for reading, as is knowing the meanings of words, spoken vocabulary knowledge. And it kind of supports reading in lots of different ways. I guess the most obvious way to think about it is that if you encounter, or a child encounters a text, and they don't know many of the words in that text, it's going to be very difficult to understand that text. So you need to know the meaning, or at least something about the meaning of almost every word in a text in order to be able to really fully understand it, to build the kind of complex mental model of what's going on in the text. And later on, I'm also going to talk about the flip side of that, that once you can read with some success, that also then feeds into your vocabulary knowledge and allows you to learn new words. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. But what I'm going to talk about today is data from two longitudinal studies. And the reason why I've used longitudinal research, I tend to do the methodology that I tend to use is either longitudinal or experimental. And the reason for that is that in a longitudinal design, what you can do is you can look at how things change over time. So you can look at development, and I'm really interested in development and change and what's happening there. But longitudinal designs also allow you to some extent to look at the relationships between variables and what the direction of the relationship might be. So if you think about vocabulary and reading, for example, it can help you to think about, you know, is vocabulary important for reading in development? Or is reading important for vocabulary and development, or a bit of both? So it allows you to tease apart the direction of those causal relationships and go a little bit beyond just saying that the two things are related to each other, they're associated. So I'm going to talk about two longitudinal studies today, and then kind of give you a hint of an intervention or experimental study that we're just about to run at the end. Now, I know we've got quite a lot of people from different countries with different education systems. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew a little bit about the UK education system, just to make sure that some of what I say makes sense, because I'm going to talk a little bit about transition from primary to secondary school. And of course, that transition point is different in different education systems. So what we've got here is just a kind of depiction of primary and secondary school. In the UK, children start primary school at 4, and that's called reception. So that's why you've got an R there. So that's the UK year. And then they spend the next few years in primary school until they get to age 11 in year 6. And then they transition into secondary schools. Now, primary schools tend to be much smaller. You have one teacher in the main. And so it's a much smaller, kind of cozier context, as in most places, most other education systems. You then go into secondary school, much bigger environment. Certainly here, kids are moving around. They're often going from class to class at the moment, not so much because of COVID, but usually they would move from class to class, have different teachers for different subjects. So it's a much more complex environment in many ways. And so there is quite a lot of interest in thinking about transition from primary to and secondary, and thinking about what the challenges there might be. And certainly there is some narrative around there being a bit of a slump in literacy skills as children transition from primary to secondary, as well as in other things, as well as other challenges across that transition. I'm going to come on to that later, because one of the things we wanted to do was to objectively look to see whether that was actually the case. So the 2 studies I'm going to talk about today are the Vocabulary and Reading in Secondary Schools project, the VaRiss project, and Nicola Dawson was the main researcher working on that project. And I'm also going to talk about the Reading and Vocabulary project, which is still running, and Sanne van der Kleij is the main researcher working on that project. Now, the VaRiss project tracked development in secondary school. So in year 7, pretty much as they entered secondary school, and then we looked at it 1 year later, reading again a year later, and then a year after that. So that was the format of that study. In the Reading and Vocabulary project, we started in year 5. So before they left primary school, and we tracked development a bit in primary, then a cross transition into secondary, and then a bit into secondary, so that we could look at some kind of complex questions around change over transition and summer breaks and things like that. But I will give you more details on that later. So I've just put them here so that you can see they kind of overlap, but they cover the period from year 5, about the age of 9 or 10, excuse me, right up to about 14. Okay, and so just sometimes it's useful just to tell you what I'm going to tell you before I do. What I'm going to cover today is some questions around development and change in reading and vocabulary in adolescence, and just show you there is progress in adolescence, and talk a bit more about what that looks like, and the context for that. That actually what the Reading and Vocabulary Project has shown us is that there's really no evidence for a slump in literacy, or reading anyway, across transition from primary to secondary, which may surprise some of you. That might be something that you're interested in talking about. And just a note really that variability in reading skills is something that's really come out. I mean, it's enormous in adolescence. So any of you working with adolescents in school will know this from your class. You know, you'll have some who are really still grappling with getting to grips with kind of the mechanics of reading, and then you've got others that are really flying. And that's completely typical in my experience of working in schools, doing research in schools. So, and then what in the second part of the session today, I'm going to talk a bit about these causal relationships between reading and vocabulary. And in the VaRiss project, what we really showed is just how closely interrelated these two things were. And then we've started to try and tease apart what's going on in the Reading and Vocabulary project. And I can give you an update on what we've been doing there. Okay, so first to talk about development. So in the VaRiss project, as I've said, we started working with pupils when they were in year 7, so they were about 12. And then we followed them up on an annual basis for 3 years. So we spent about 2 hours each year assessing their reading and vocabulary skills. We started off with just over 200 pupils, and we had very little attrition over time, which was really good news. We published a paper summarising what I'm going to talk about now. It's open access in Scientific Studies of Reading if you want to get hold of it. And we can send around a link. And we have also put together a kind of poster for parents and teachers on our website that you can have a look at as well, that just summarises the key findings. as I said, Nikki Dawson worked on this project, and we deliberately selected children who were kind of average. We wanted to have a kind of average spread of pupils, given the kind of regional and national norms in this area in the UK. One of the purposes of this project was to measure just two things, reading and vocabulary, and measure them really well. So that was really what I wanted to do. And so for that reason, we had 2 measures of spoken vocabulary, which in itself is unusual. And in doing that, we managed to capture not only how many words a child knows, so the breadth of their vocabulary knowledge, but also what children know about, what pupils know about individual words. So depth of vocabulary knowledge. Because of course, it's not really an all or nothing thing. It matters how much you know about a word, whether you know it in different contexts and different senses and so on. In terms of measuring reading, we had 6 measures of word level reading, so the ability to read words, for example, and we had 4 measures of reading comprehension, which is, you know, notoriously a very difficult thing to measure because it's so complex. We needed to do that partly in order to capture the variation that we expected to see in reading abilities. And in terms of development, what we decided to do was to look for 3 different kinds of processes. So what we're used to thinking about, I think, in relation to development is growth, progress. So, you know, are there meaningful changes over time? Are they getting better over time? So that was one thing that we looked at. But we also looked at 2 other developmental processes, which are really important for thinking, particularly thinking about the context of growth. So we looked at stability, and that's to do with the pecking order amongst pupils. So where they are in rank order, if you put them all in order of their ability, if you like, where they are, and does that remain consistent over time? And you can see that here. So you can see all of the dots. I think my mouse will work. Danny, you can nod at me if my mouse is working. So you can see the dots here. So that's the kind of pecking order of kids, if you like. And this is where they are earlier in time, and this is where they are later in time. And does that remain kind of consistent? In these 3 graphs, it is completely consistent, but it's not necessarily the case. You might see things kind of moving around, and certainly earlier in development, that seems to be much more the case. The third thing that we looked at was spread, and this relates to the notion of Matthew effects, which some of you might have heard of, and that is a term that comes from the Bible, and what it talks about really is the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So if you start off from a better place, are you likely to really fly, you know, exponentially? And if you start off from a more challenging place, are you likely to show less progress, basically, over time? So it's about distinguishing between starting point and the kind of trajectory that you show, so how you change over time, and the rate of growth as well. So it allows you to think about those kinds of processes, all 3 processes. So what we decided is that we wanted to look at all 3 of these things so that we could get a really good handle on what's going on. And what we expected to see was high stability, what we had seen in previous research, and therefore what we expected was that there would be quite high stability, because actually earlier in development it's already starting to become quite high by about the age of 9 or 10. So we did expect to see that the pecking order amongst pupils would be quite consistent over time. We did expect to see some growth, perhaps. I mean, certainly there's substantial growth in reading earlier on in development. I mean, any of you who are teaching children to read will know that certainly some children just fly and show amazing progress in a very short period of time. And what we expect to see probably was Matthew effects, because there are some reports of Matthew effects for reading. So this is a kind of funneling out. So you can see this on the right here, but a kind of funneling out of performance, with those who start off in a better place showing more progress. Okay, so a kind of rich get richer type effect. So this is what we were expecting on the basis of previous research, but nobody had tracked this within adolescence before, so we weren't 100% sure. Now, I've shown you these graphs in the hope that these kind of idealized graphs in blue here, in the hope that they help you to think about these different processes and how they're different. So, you know, you've got progress is the amount of change here, so the slope of this line. Then you've got pecking order, which is where the dots are here. And then you've got spread, which is whether these lines remain parallel, or whether they start getting closer together, or whether they start funneling out. And this is the kind of Matthew effect here. And I have actually done this for my data just so that you can visualize a bit better, hopefully, what's going on. And what we did in order to do this is we could have just shown you individual trajectories for all of the 200 kids, but that just would have looked very messy, and it probably would have been quite difficult to see what was going on. So what I did instead is I divided my data into 10% bins. So you've got 200 kids in total, so it's about 20 kids are contributing to each line, and this is what they're going to look like. And then you just get a slightly better sense of what's going on in the data, I hope. So this down here is the bottom 10%, so the children who are the bottom 10% who are doing least well in terms of whatever it is that we're measuring. And at the top here, we have the kind of most able 10%, if that makes sense. So hopefully these are clear, and it's just to allow you to visualize the data a bit more. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the different things that we measured so that you can see what the pattern of finding was in terms of progress, stability, and spread. And so what you can see for reading comprehension here is you can see some growth. So overall, you can see that things are changing for the better. So there is some improvement in reading comprehension over time. There is very, very, very high stability. And this was the really striking thing. We did expect stability, this kind of pecking order thing, to be really high. But as my colleague Charles Hume said when we first looked at the data, it's eye-wateringly high. So you can think about it a little bit like a correlation, that you're talking about a relationship of 0.99999 between what's going on at age 12, so this is age 12 here, what's going on at age 13, and then at age 14. Okay, so it's really, really high, the stability. But it's not the be all and end all, because there is still some growth that's happening across the board. And actually, instead of seeing the Matthew effects that we thought we might see, if anything, we're certainly not seeing things widening, but if anything, things might be narrowing a little bit here. But we can talk about that a bit more if people are interested. So moving on to word reading, we saw a very similar pattern. So there is some progress. It's small compared to what you might see at age 7, but perhaps still probably still functionally relevant, be still important on the ground in terms of what they're doing and what can do. Very high stability again, and again evidence that the gap was narrowing. And then moving on to spoken vocabulary, so what they know about the meanings of words. Again, we saw the same pattern. So there was significant small, but probably relevant to them, growth happening over time. So it was significant year on year. Very high stability again, and the gap is narrowing a little bit, if anything. It's certainly not widening, which I think is quite encouraging, because of course we do worry about these gaps widening amongst kids. So just to summarize then across those findings, so we did see some significant growth. So it might be small, but you know, it might actually be making a difference to children. So it's certainly not fair to say that there's nothing changing in adolescence. That interesting things are happening, and there is growth happening. We are looking at a limited developmental time frame, so it might be that if I'd looked, you know, from 12 to 16, or certainly if I'd looked from 7 to 16, we would have seen much more growth over time. And we were looking deliberately, focusing very much on this early secondary period. And of course, I mean, even though the growth in the things that we measured was quite small in real terms, they're clearly learning lots of new things. And one of the things I'm going to talk about a bit later is curriculum focused vocabulary. What we were measuring in this project was kind of everyday vocabulary. If you're used to thinking about the tiers of vocabulary, it was more like tier 1 and tier maybe a bit of tier 2, but tier 1 is kind of everyday vocabulary that people use in their everyday language and in conversation. And that's mostly what we were measuring here, to be honest. And of course, what in secondary school, what they're probably learning most of is curriculum relevant vocabulary that's important for what they're doing at school. And we did measure that in the next project that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So we can think a bit more about that in a sec. So we did see this very high stability. Now, this had been shown in terms of spoken language, but not in terms of reading when you look at it kind of on its own. So it was consistent with Mark Bornstein and other people's research on that. Quite interested to see, to kind of not see evidence that these gaps were widening. And if anything, they could be narrowing a little bit. There could be a bit of kind of catching up going on. Now, you might, if you're used to thinking about kind of ceiling effects, you might have been a bit concerned that maybe the more able children were kind of almost at the test maximum, and so there wasn't really any space to go. Now, you can make that argument perhaps for reading comprehension, though they weren't at the test maximum. But certainly not for the vocabulary measures. There was lots of room to grow on the vocabulary measures. So, you know, there certainly is some evidence here that that gaps aren't widening. So I think that is important. If we were doing a bit more, I mean, I don't know what the picture is in Australia, but in the UK, there's not that much intervention going on or kind of general day-to-day support going on for language and literacy in secondary schools. So if we were doing more, maybe we would see more closing of those gaps, or narrowing, I should say. I don't think they'll close, but narrowing of those gaps. Okay, so moving on then to talk about the reading and vocabulary project. So the VaRiss project is looking at the beginning of secondary schools. So for us, that's year 7, year 8, year 9, age 12, 13, 14, just after they transition into secondary school. What the RAV project did, and we did start this project after I finished the VaRiss project, was just rewind a bit to kind of make that connection between primary and secondary school and look at this transition period. It's a bigger project actually, and it's part of the Aston Literacy Project, which Laura Shapiro has been running for quite some time now. So she started researching kids when they were 4 in the Aston Literacy Project, and we picked them up at age 10 for this part of the project that I'm going to talk about today. But just to note that it's part of a longitudinal study. And it is a slightly bigger study than the VaRiss study. We did lose quite a lot of participants here when we needed to reconsent them with GDPR, which I can explain to you if you're interested. But we still do have a really nice, and then actually we didn't lose many when they transitioned from 16 primary schools to 53 secondary schools. And that's mainly down to Sana and her amazing hard work keeping that going. So we still have got a good number of participants there, even though we've tracked them. They're now kind of here. So even though we've been tracking them since they were 4. Now the measures that we used in this project cover a bit more of a range. But today I'm just going to focus on similar measures to the ones that I've been talking about. So measures of word reading, reading comprehension, and vocabulary knowledge. But as I mentioned before, we've got a kind of everyday vocabulary knowledge measure, which is the British Picture Vocabulary Scale, if people are used to using that, or much like the PPVT, it's based on the PPVT for those who are in the States. But we also developed our own curriculum relevant measure, which is trying to capture tier 3 vocabulary, if you're used to thinking in those terms, kind of specialist vocabulary. I'm just going to do a quick check on time. Okay. Now, just to show you what the graphs are going to look like for this part of the project. Danny, actually, I don't know how long how long you expect me, when do you want me to stop?
You can go up to 6:55, but then we only have 5 minutes for questions.
Oh no, I'll try, and I think another 10 minutes should be plenty. So I want to have plenty of time for questions. We'll see how we go. Okay, thank you. So just to kind of make it really clear what we were able to capture. And so what I'm going to talk about today is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chunks of data from this project. We have got more that we've just collected, but they haven't been analysed yet. And so this is year 5 here, And the year groups are more relevant for what I'm going to talk about because it's to do with the summer periods and things. And then this is about a year later. So the distance between these shows the amount of time. This is about a year later in year 6, towards the end of year 6. This is at the beginning of year 7, after they've moved into secondary school. This is at the end of year 7. And this is at the beginning of year 8. So these are summer periods. This is a transition summer period from primary to secondary. And this is a within secondary summer period, if that makes sense. Just kind of moving from one year group to the next year group. And then this period here is during the school year. Okay, so it just allows us to distinguish between the kinds of growth that's happening at different times. And also for me to just mention, because these graphs that Sana did are so beautiful, you can see here, so these are all of the children in our study. Each dot represents an individual child, and you can see the sheer spread of ability here. It's really quite marked, and it was the same was true in the VaRiss project as well. Really variable knowledge and skills in terms of vocabulary and reading. And I think it's just worth saying that what that really means in real terms is that there will be about 4 or 5 in any classroom of 30 kids, there will be 4 or 5 who are struggling a bit with some kind of reading ability, and there will be a similar number who are struggling with vocabulary to some extent. And then of course, some of those kids will be having challenges with more than one thing. So it's worth remembering that. And at the bottom here, when you look at what the kids are able to do, actually they resemble what we would typically expect of a 6 to 9-year-old child. Now, if you think about those, and that's true, that's just as true in year 8 as it is in year 5. So when you think about year 8, and these are kids who are 13, you know, that means that they're operating at a level that is kind of really not appropriate for accessing the curriculum that they're expected to access. So there is a mismatch. And these kids at the bottom, you know, will be struggling to access basic language expectations in the curriculum. Now, the main question that I'm going to try and address today with these data is there a transition slump? Because there was quite a lot of narrative around it, and some data, but nothing that compares a transition summer with a non-transition summer using objective measures that are the same over time and administered the same over time. So that's what we did. Now, in terms of word reading, what we saw was that there was significant growth between each time point. So during the school year and over the summer holidays, there was always some growth in word reading. For reading comprehension, there was growth during the school year, but not across either of the summer holidays. So it didn't matter whether it was a transition or a non-transition summer holiday. There was less growth over the summer than in the school year. In terms of everyday vocabulary, we saw growth between each time point, like with word reading. So during the school year, they got a bit better in terms of what they knew, and over the summer holidays. Whereas in terms of curriculum relevant vocabulary, and what we used was a measure taken from the biology and physics curriculum here in the UK. And in that measure, we saw growth during the school year when they're encountering those subjects, but not over the summer holiday. So some really interesting patterns. And I think one of the really interesting things kind of retrospectively from this study, I would say, is that it shows you it's really important to think about vocabulary knowledge. It's not just one thing. If we had just measured vocabulary in a more typical way for research, like the way that I did in the VaRiss project, we would have just seen this consistent growth in all of the periods. But it was only because we kind of acknowledged that there were these different kinds of vocabulary. It may seem completely obvious to those teachers out there, but not necessarily obvious in research. And it was only that we thought, oh, well, we really must make sure that we have a measure that's much more aligned with what they're learning in school so that we can capture that learning. And it was only by doing that and separating these measures that we saw these different trajectories in terms of growth. And it's an important reminder to think about the way that we are measuring things. Okay, so in terms of development from the RAV project, there is progress across transition, depends a bit on what you're measuring. So there's there's growth irrespective of when for word reading and everyday vocabulary knowledge. Importantly though, the transition summer looks the same as the non-transition summer for all of our measures. So there's really no evidence of a slump, okay, which I think was really interesting for us to find. Big variability, and it is important to remember that some of those kids really do not have the knowledge and skills that they need to access the curriculum. And I think it's very easy to forget that that's the case. And that's something I've spent a lot of time recently talking to teachers about, and how they can be thinking about that when they're trying to manage a class. You know, it's a big challenge for teachers, right, to manage a class with such variable knowledge and skills. But it is important to remember that some kids in the class just might not have the everyday vocabulary that you expect most kids to have. So there is growth, but it's quite limited. And there's this very, very high stability, as I talked about in the VaRiss project. And so you might think, okay, well, that sounds quite bleak. I mean, you know, is it not worth bothering? You know, is there anything that we can do? And I would argue quite strongly that there still is something you can do. I mean, the goal of intervention may well not be to change position within the rank, but rather to try and, you know, move the whole distribution up, maybe. That's certainly what seems to have happened in terms of phonics input here in the UK, that, you know, the whole distribution is certainly picking up that bottom end of the scale and leveling the playing field a little bit. Those are all things that are possible. Stability doesn't stop that from being possible. And just because there isn't that much growth at the moment doesn't mean that we couldn't see much more progress if we were doing more. In the UK, where these studies were done, some stuff is happening, but it's very patchy. If we were doing more, I think we certainly could be seeing much more progress. And of course, it matters how you measure things. Measuring things that are happening at school, of course, are going to be more sensitive to the changes that are happening, like curriculum relevant vocabulary. But certainly the bottom line, really, from talking to so many teachers and other practitioners, is that in secondary, is that they don't have the knowledge and they don't have the resources and materials that they need to provide the kind of support that they want to. And so I think there is a big call, certainly here in the UK, for them to have much more of that. And the government are starting to pick that up. There's certainly been lots of discussion in Parliament recently about oracy and the importance of spoken language as well as literacy in schools, including secondary schools. So hopefully there's a bit of a sea change happening there. Now, what I'm going to do for the last few minutes is I'm going to talk about causal relationships between reading and vocabulary. And really the bottom line here from the VaRiss project. So I talked about the importance of vocabulary knowledge for reading, that you need to know lots about words in order to fully understand something that you're reading. And certainly what we found in the VaRiss project, and I needn't really go into any detail here, though of course I can in questions if you're interested, and you can certainly follow up by reading the paper, is that reading, particularly reading comprehension and vocabulary, are just really, really closely linked. It's almost, in our study, it looked impossible to kind of measure them separately, really. They're so closely linked. And it kind of laid the foundations in part for thinking about the relationship between reading and vocabulary in the Reading and Vocabulary project. And of course, then it becomes important to start thinking about reading as a vehicle for learning new vocabulary. And I've got two quotes here, particularly like the one from Tyrion Lannister. I don't know how many Game of Thrones fans there are out there, but I'm certainly a fan. A mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. If it is to keep its edge, that's why I read so much. And then there's a more well-known Dr. Seuss quote as well there. And basically what that's saying is, you know, reading is just so important for learning, and particularly for learning, in this case, about new words. And we know that children can and do learn new words through the process of reading. And I encountered this recently myself because I was reading the Norse myths to my son. And I don't know if any of you have read these, but I found it incredibly difficult to read this to my son. I'm quite a reasonably good reader. I read a lot. I found it really difficult to read this aloud. And I realized it's because there are lots of words in there that I didn't know. And as I read the book, and him and I started learning the new words of all the different people and the places and all of that kind of stuff. I didn't have much background knowledge in this, you see. Then I started to find that I could read it more fluently and with better comprehension. There were some sections we just had to go back and reread because neither of us were following it at all, which was kind of interesting. And of course, what that tells us is that these experiences of reading give us the opportunity to learn these words. We can learn about what they look like. We can also learn about what they mean. And what we were interested in doing in the RAV project is looking at how reading, and actually word reading ability in this case, is related to growth in vocabulary over time. Now, usually the assumption is that if you're a better reader, you're going to read more, and therefore you're going to learn more words. And that's the way that the relationship works. So it's this kind of indirect relationship. Because, you know, if you read more, then you will just be exposed to more words, and then you will learn more words. You'll have the opportunity to learn more words. But it's worth noting that you need to be a good reader in order to be able to read more. But also that it's possible that your ability to read words is more directly related to your ability to learn new words. And that's because actually being able to read words and learning new words or knowledge about the meanings of words are based on the same, we think, based on the same knowledge structures of what words sound like and what they mean, and also what they look like. So these two things might be related in a more direct way. So what we set out to look at in this project is if you've got reading ability here, and you've got the learning of new words here, do we see a direct relationship from reading ability to learning new words, or is the relationship indirect? And this is based on the RAV project that is looking at this transitional period from primary to secondary school. And in short, what we found is that both things were true. So in more technical terms, we found partial mediation. So we saw a direct pathway from how good you are at reading to how many words you learn, or how your vocabulary knowledge changes over time, I should say, in this particular analysis. And then also an indirect pathway through the amount of reading that kids are doing. Okay, so both of those things are important. And what that really suggests is that if we improve reading abilities, it will not only improve reading, but also, we hope, or we expect, have knock-on effects for vocabulary over time as well. And then, of course, we can continue to do interventions or activities. I don't know whether this is popular in Australia, but certainly in the UK, drop everything and read is a really popular approach. Some people have some issues with that approach, but the idea really is about giving pupils an opportunity to read, encouraging them, giving them space to read, and trying to get them to read more. So it's important that we think about getting pupils to read more, which I think is much more part of what's happening currently in secondary schools. But we need to remember that they also need to have the knowledge and skills. So for some kids, we also need to be putting in place interventions so that they have the knowledge and skills that will allow them to benefit from reading more. Now, I mentioned that we're just about to run an intervention study or an experimental study where we are going to be encouraging students to read more and tracking the vocabulary learning that happens when they're reading some particular books. And I can certainly tell you more about that later, and I can come back and tell you about it next year. Hopefully it's going to run in the autumn. We've had to delay it. It was supposed to run a year and a half ago. We've had to delay it. We have got a stage 1 registered report accepted in Scientific Studies of Reading, so it's all set and ready to go, and hopefully we'll be able to do it in the autumn, we'll see. But watch this space on that one. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention very briefly is that what we felt was missing in all of this, Laura Shapiro and myself, my collaborator on the RAV project, was thinking about motivation. And we're just about to embark on a new project with Sarah McGowan at Edinburgh, looking at motivation and how we can promote motivation for reading as well. And we'll be very much working collaboratively with teachers to do that. Okay, so that's really everything that I wanted to say today. So there are interesting things happening in terms of development and change in reading and vocabulary, and that matters, I think, and it will matter in terms of educational outcomes, and that's something that I'm following up at the moment. And that also reading and vocabulary are very closely linked, and it's important therefore to think about support for both of those things, and also for spoken language, of course, more generally. There's much more to language than vocabulary knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I did hope to finish a bit sooner, but it is about 5 to now by my watch, so hopefully there's some time for questions. If people do have questions, feel free to put them on Twitter, and I will answer them, or to email me, and hopefully we can cover some questions now. So I'll pass over back to Danny.
Thank you so much, Jessie, for a fantastic talk. I can see that there have been some questions in the chat. So I might scroll back just a little bit. There was one clarification question from Sachiko. I think it was about the stability aspect. So just to be sure, the bottom 10%, say at phase 1 of the study, are the same kids that are in the bottom 10% at phase 2 and phase 3.
Yeah, so I divided them into those groups on the basis of their performance at age 12 and kept them in those groups over time. Yeah.
Okay, and then Sarah Woodcock-Davis asked, I'd love to know more. What I would love to know more about is how we can support students in high school who are operating well below expectations in a way that meets them where they're at and preserves their dignity.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think so I'm working with all of the secondary schools in Blackpool at the moment, which is a region in the UK where there's quite a lot of deprivation and there's quite a lot of concern about literacy. And so we are just kind of starting to think about what to do. And one answer to that question is assessment, I think, because I think you need to know what it is specifically that they are struggling with. So there's a number of different candidates. So it might be that word reading is still a challenge for some of these kids. I mean, it is. We know from the data, certainly the data that I've collected suggests that word reading is still a challenge for some of these kids. And in that situation, we really need to be using strategies that are addressing their word reading skills. But it might be that alternatively, or in addition, comprehension skills and language skills are also an issue. And so I think at minimum, we need to be measuring spoken language and reading comprehension and word reading to make sure that any strategies that we're using are appropriately targeted. So we're not doing anything based on word reading with those who really have got beyond that point. And I think that the bottom part of the distribution at secondary do cover that range. So it goes from children who are still struggling with reading individual words to those for whom it's really a fluency issue. They can read the words given enough time, but you need to promote their fluency so that they free up bandwidth so that they can understand what they're reading. And then for some of them, it's much more about the language and the comprehension. So we need to be, they're quite a heterogeneous group, and we need to be making sure that we do the right things. In terms of what exactly to do, there is indicative evidence out there, but there's very little robust evidence for exactly what works in secondary school, and we're still working on that. A really good source of resources here in the UK, in case it's useful to you guys, is the Education Endowment Foundation. They published guidance that I helped them with on secondary reading, but also they evaluate interventions, and there is some indicative evidence there of things that we can think about for support and intervention. But I guess what we want is a combination of what we might call quality first teaching or universal strategies that you use with everyone in the classroom that are going to benefit those who are doing well as those who aren't, but also thinking about what the more targeted strategies might be for those who are really struggling.
Okay, thank you so much.
Trying to squeeze a lot of things into a short answer. So happy to expand on any of that.
It's 7 p.m. here now, so we're running out of time. I can see people have more questions, but you have Jessie's Twitter handle there and her email address, I think. Is that on there? No,
it's not on here. Sorry, I didn't put it on here, but it's
maybe
very easy to find it. Just Google.
Chat. And yes, thank you so much for a really fantastic talk. The recording will be made available to everybody who registered, and it's also going to go on our Facebook page. So if anybody missed anything, that will be available. Yes, so thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just looking through the questions, very interesting. So I'll ponder them as we go on. Thank you, everybody.